What's up, everyone? Today I got two short stories for you. One is legit and the other is a lie. The Pigman Butcher. This story takes place in Angola, New York. Long before the locals of Angola, New York began calling him the Pigman, Wallace Brent had been simply known as the quiet son of a struggling farm family on the edge of town. His father ran a modest slaughterhouse behind their farmhouse where farmers from the surrounding countryside brought hogs to be processed. From the time Wallace was old enough to lift a knife, he worked beside his father in a cold wooden building that smelled of iron and smoke. The work was harsh and repetitive, but Wallace showed an unsettling talent for it. By 15, he could dress a carcass faster than most grown men who came through the doors. Neighbors remembered him as polite but distant, a boy who spoke little and watched everything with careful eyes. Life on the farm grew harder when the Great Depression tightened his grip on rural towns across the country. Orders for meat slowed, debts piled up, and the Brent property slowly began to deteriorate under financial strain. Wallace's father grew older and more bitter, while his mother rarely left the house at all. At 18, Wallace made a decision that surprised many in town and enlisted in the army. The steady pay, he said, would help his family keep the land from being taken by the bank. Few people from Angola ever traveled far beyond western New York, and the war carried Wallace farther than anyone had expected. When he left town, he was a thin, serious young man who kept his eyes on the ground and rarely raised his voice. When Wallace finally returned years later, something about him changed in ways no one could quite explain. A jagged scar ran from his temple down along his jaw, pulling the skin tight and partially twisting his mouth. His nose looked as though it had been broken more than once and poorly reset each time. The distant look in his eyes unsettled people who had known him since childhood. He spoke even less than before and seemed to study people the way a butcher studies an animal before making the first cut. Within weeks of returning home, he reopened the old slaughterhouse behind the farmhouse as if the war had never happened. The Brent property sat at the far end of a narrow rural road known officially as Holland Road. The road wound through thick woods and marshy fields before ending near an old wooden bridge that crossed a shallow creek. Only a handful of farms existed along that stretch of land, and most of them were separated by long, empty distances. Wallace repaired the small butcher shop attached to the farmhouse and began raising hogs again on the surrounding acreage. The pigs could often be heard squealing from deep within the trees, their sounds carrying across the quiet countryside. For the most part, however, Wallace kept to himself and rarely allowed anyone on the property. Most residents of Angola only saw Wallace a few times each year when he would come into town for supplies. He usually arrived just after sunrise when the streets were still quiet and the store owners were opening their doors. He wore a heavy coat regardless of the season and a wide-brimmed hat that cast a shadow across most of his face. Wallace spoke in short sentences and never lingered longer than necessary. Clerks remembered that he seemed uncomfortable indoors, as though he preferred the open air and the isolation of the countryside. Within minutes, he would disappear again down the long road leading back to his farm. What people remember most about Wallace Brent was not his silence or strange habits, it was his face. The scar that crossed his cheek pulled his features into an unnatural shape that made even a neutral expression look threatening. His flattened nose and thick beard added to the unsettling appearance. Children in town whispered about him whenever they caught a glimpse of him walking down the sidewalk. Some of them said he looked like one of the animals he butchered. It didn't take long for the nickname to begin circulating among the younger residents. At first, it was only whispered between schoolchildren who dared each other to say it out loud. Eventually, the name spread quietly among the adults as well. Behind Wallace's back, people began referring to him as the Pigman. No one ever used that nickname to his face, but it traveled quickly through the small town. In places like Angola, unusual stories had a way of growing larger each time they were told. Rumors about the Brent property began appearing not long after Wallace reopened the slaughterhouse. Hunters passing through the woods reported seeing strange shapes surrounding the yard. Teenagers claimed they could smell rot long before they reached the house. A few people insisted they had heard pigs squealing late at night, even during seasons when Wallace should have not had livestock. Others believed the strange activity was nothing more than natural byproduct of a working farm. But the stories continued to spread nonetheless. Eventually, someone described what they had actually seen near the edge of the property. Pig heads had been mounted on wooden stakes and driven into the ground around the farmhouse. They formed an uneven perimeter that surrounded the yard like a grotesque fence. Some of the heads appeared freshly cut, their pale skin stretched tight across bone. Others were old and blackened, picked apart by birds until only fragments remained. The sight was disturbing enough that most visitors turned around immediately. The smell alone was enough to convince many people to stay away. On humid days, it drifted through the trees like a thick, invisible cloud. Even hunters accustomed to the scent of blood found it overwhelming. The road leading past the property slowly gained a darker reputation. Fewer people traveled it unless they had a reason. Over time, locals began referring to the area simply as Pigman Road. Teenagers, however, have never been particularly good at avoiding places they are told to fear. In the autumn of 1958, a 17-year-old boy named Kenny Stark decided he was going to prove the stories were nothing more than small-town superstition. Kenny was well known around Angola as the kid who never backed down from a dare. He was tall, confident, and reckless in a way that often makes adults uneasy. On the night it happened, he was riding around with two friends, Mike Harlow and Danny Pierce. The three boys had been driving aimlessly through the countryside in Danny's aging Chevrolet. At some point during the drive, someone mentioned Pigman Road. The conversation began with jokes about pig heads and the strange butcher who lived out there. One of the boys claimed that no one ever walked up to the farmhouse after dark. Another said he had heard pigs screaming in the woods long after midnight. Kenny laughed loudly and leaned forward from the back seat. He announced that he would walk right up to the front porch. The others tried to act unimpressed as Danny turned the car onto a narrow road that cut into the trees. Branches scraped alongside the vehicle as they drove deeper into the woods. Their headlights created a narrow tunnel of pale light through the darkness. None of them spoke much during the drive. Even Kenny seemed quieter as the car rolled slowly forward. When the farmhouse finally appeared, it seemed to rise out of the darkness like a decaying silhouette. The building leaned slightly to one side, its weathered boards barely visible beneath the moonlight. The boys immediately noticed the stakes scattered across the yard. Pig heads sat atop them in crooked rows. For several seconds, no one moved or spoke. The air smelled faintly of rot drifting through the open windows. Then Kenny opened the door and stepped out of the car. He grabbed a flashlight and turned back towards his friends with a grin. Mike muttered the whole thing was a bad idea, but Kenny waved him off dismissively. The beam of the flashlight bounced across the ground as he walked towards the house. Each step carried him deeper into the strange arrangement of stakes. The pig head seemed to stare at him from every direction. Danny switched the headlights to high beam, flooding the yard with light. Kenny turned back towards the car and lifted the flashlight like a trophy. He shouted something about taking a picture so no one in town could call him a liar. The porch steps creaked as he stepped forward. For a moment, everything seemed strangely quiet. Then the scream came. It was high and sharp, the kind of sound that immediately sends a shock through anyone who hears it. The scream cut off suddenly, as though someone had thrown a switch. Mike and Danny jumped out of the car and ran towards the house. Kenny's flashlight laid in the dirt near the porch. "Kenny?" Mike shouted into the darkness. His voice echoed strangely among the trees. There was no answer from the porch or the yard. Danny swore later that he saw movement near the edge of the woods. For just a second, he thought he saw a tall figure slipping between the trees. The boys ran back to the car without saying another word. Danny slammed the car into gear and sped down the road towards town. Neither of them looked back to see if anyone followed. By the time they reached the police station, both boys were pale and nearly incoherent. The story they told police sounded confused and unbelievable. Authorities searched Holland Road the following morning. They found the farmhouse exactly where the boys had described it. The stakes were still on the ground and the pig head still surrounded the yard. Kenny's flashlight remained near the porch steps where he had dropped it, but Kenny himself had vanished completely. There was no blood and no sign of a struggle anywhere on the property. Inside the butcher shop, investigators found rusted hooks hanging from the ceiling. Old cutting tables sat covered in dust and cobwebs as if the place had not been used in months. The smell of spoiled meat lingered faintly in the air. Wallace Bryn was nowhere to be found. His truck was gone, and no one in town remembered seeing him during the previous week. Without evidence, the investigation quickly reached a dead end and the police labeled it as a missing persons case. Some residents believed Kenny had run away. Others insisted the pigmen had finally done something terrible. The farmhouse stood empty for years afterwards, slowly decaying as the woods crept closer around it. Eventually, groups of teenagers began sneaking inside the abandoned building. Most came back with exaggerated stories meant to frighten their friends, but one group returned looking seriously shaken. They claimed they had found something hanging from one of the old meat hooks in the center of the shop. It was only a piece of cloth, but the colors were unmistakable. red and white fabric from the sleeve of a varsity jacket. Kenny Stark had been wearing one the night he disappeared. When authorities searched the building again, the sleeve was nowhere to be found. By the mid-1960s, a violent storm damaged the old wooden bridge at the end of Holland Road. Rather than repair it, the county closed the road completely. Trees and brush slowly reclaimed the pavement until the farmhouse disappeared behind the thick growth. To this day, Kenny Stark has never been found. The Coffin Knock. This story takes place in Quito, Ecuador. Bella Montoya had spent most of her life caring for others. She was born in the humid coastal lowlands of Ecuador, where narrow dirt roads wound between rice fields and banana plantations. Her childhood home was small and simple, just a structure built from concrete blocks. Her parents believed deeply in hard work, and Bella grew up learning that compassion was as important as survival. When illness swept through the village during her teenage years, she often watched helplessly as neighbors waited hours for medical help to arrive. Those memories stayed with her, quietly shaping the direction her life would take. As a young woman, Bella decided she wanted to become a nurse. The local clinic was always overcrowded, and the handful of doctors there struggled to keep up with the needs of the surrounding communities. Bella volunteered whenever she could, carrying supplies, cleaning rooms, and assisting nurses who were too busy to notice the young girl observing every detail. She paid close attention to the way experienced nurses calmed frightened patients with nothing more than a gentle voice and steady hands. To Bella, medicine was not just science, it was trust. When she finally enrolled in nursing training in her early 20s, she carried that belief with her. By the time Bella had finished her training, she had developed a reputation for quiet determination. The hospital wards where she worked were often overcrowded, filled with the sounds of coughing patients and the constant movement of staff rushing between beds. Ceiling fans spun slowly above rows of metal frames, doing little to cut through the tropical heat. Bella learned quickly how to manage chaos without losing her composure. She had a way of speaking to patients that made them feel safe even during the worst emergencies. Doctors began requesting her during difficult cases because she never seemed to panic. Years turned into decades inside those hospital corridors. Bella worked overnight shifts during outbreaks of dengue fever and long days during accident emergencies that flooded the emergency room. She saw lives saved and lives lost, and each experience shaped her understanding of how fragile a human body could be. Colleagues trusted her instincts because she noticed things that others sometimes overlooked. If a patient's breathing changed even slightly, Bella would be the first to react. Over time, patients and families began recognizing her name, often asking if Nurse Bella was working that day. For more than 30 years, Bella Montoya remained one of the most respected nurses at the hospital. Her coworkers described her as calm, even in moments when alarms blared and doctors shouted orders across crowded rooms. She rarely spoke about her own exhaustion, even after finishing double shifts during medical emergencies. For Bella, the job had never been about recognition. It was simply the work she believed she was born to do. When she finally retired in her late 60s, many of her colleagues struggled to imagine the hospital without her. Retirement brought Bella back to a quieter life in the city. Her small house sat along a street lined with mango trees, where afternoon rainstorms rolled in from the surrounding lowlands. She spent mornings tending to a garden behind the house, watering herbs and vegetables she had planted carefully in neat rows. The pace of life slowed, but her habits remained the same. She still woke up early and moved through the day with the quiet discipline she had learned in the hospital. To Bella, retirement simply meant fewer emergencies and more time with family. Despite stepping away from professional nursing, Bella never stopped helping the people around her. Neighbors frequently knocked on her door asking for advice about headaches, fevers, or minor injuries. Bella kept a small medical kit in her kitchen cabinet, stocked with bandages, thermometers, and blood pressure cuffs. She would sit with worried parents while examining a child's scraped knee or listening to the steady rhythm of someone's heartbeat. Her calm reassurance carried the same confidence she had once shown in the hospital wards. In many ways, retirement had simply moved her practice from a hospital to her neighborhood. Her son Gilberto often joked that Bella had never truly stopped being a nurse. Even during family gatherings, she paid quiet attention to the people around her, noticing subtle changes in their posture or breathing that others ignored. If someone mentioned feeling dizzy or tired, Bella would ask questions with professional precision. Gilberto sometimes teased her about it, but he knew her instincts came from decades of experience. Caring for others had become second nature to her. It was simply part of who she was. On a warm Friday morning, Bella sat at her kitchen table sipping coffee while sunlight streamed through the window. The day felt ordinary, the kind that passed without notice in a quiet neighborhood. She had spent the morning watering her plants and sweeping away falling leaves from the patio. Her son had stopped by briefly before heading to work, chatting casually with his mother about the rising heat in the city. Nothing about the morning suggested that anything unusual was about to happen. It seemed like any other day. Then, sometime later that afternoon, Bella suddenly collapsed inside the house. When Gilberto arrived and found her unconscious, panic set in immediately. Her breathing was faint and irregular, and her skin had turned pale. He called for an ambulance, his voice shaking as he explained the situation to emergency operators. Within minutes, paramedics arrived and rushed Bella onto a stretcher and into the ambulance. Sirens echoed through the streets as the ambulance sped towards the hospital. Inside the emergency room, doctors quickly suspected she might be suffering from a stroke. Nurses moved swiftly around the bed, attaching monitors and preparing medications. Bella lay motionless while machines began tracking her vital signs. The room filled with the steady beeping of monitors and the quiet urgency of medical staff exchanging instructions. Despite their efforts, Bella's heart suddenly stopped. The atmosphere shifted instantly from concern to crisis. Doctors began performing CPR. Chest compressions rocked Bella's body while nurses administered medication through an IV line. A ventilator mask was pressed firmly over her face as staff worked desperately to restore her heartbeat. Minutes passed with no response from the monitors. The tension in the room grew heavier as the resuscitation attempts continued. Eventually, the doctor leading the effort stepped back. The silence that followed felt final. The machine showed no sign of life, and Bella remained completely unresponsive. After several attempts to restart her heart, the medical team made the difficult decision to stop. The attending physician removed his gloves and glanced toward the clock on the wall. The time of death was quietly recorded. The emergency room staff began preparing the necessary paperwork. Gilberto waited anxiously in the hallway outside. When the doctor approached him, the expression on his face told the story before he even spoke. The news was delivered gently but directly. Bella Montoya, the retired nurse who had spent decades saving lives, had been declared dead. Gilberto felt the words settle over him like a heavy weight. Everything seemed to move quickly after that. Hospital staff handed him official documents, including his mother's identification and a death certificate. Arrangements were made with a local funeral home to prepare Bella's body for a wake. Gilberto barely remembers signing the paperwork that followed. Grief has a way of blurring details, turning hours into fragments of memory. By evening, Bella Montoya had been placed inside a polished wooden coffin. The funeral home was small and modest. A narrow viewing room had been arranged with plastic chairs along the walls and the standing fan humming near the doorway. White lilies surrounded the coffin, their sweet scent mixing with the faint smell of candle wax. Relatives gathered quietly, offering condolences and sharing memories about Bella's long life. The atmosphere felt heavy but peaceful. Everyone was saying their final goodbyes. Gilberto sat near the coffin, exhausted from the emotional whirlwind of the day. His eyes drifted repeatedly towards the polished lid that separated him from his mother. Only that morning she had been alive, drinking coffee at the kitchen table. Now she lay inside a coffin surrounded by flowers. The speed of it felt impossible to accept. Grief left him feeling numb. Hours passed as relatives spoke softly among themselves. Some prayed quietly, rosaries sliding through their fingers as they whispered familiar prayers. Others recalled Bella's years working as a nurse and the countless people she had helped. Outside, the sun began to set, and the room grew dimmer under the warm glow of the candles. The fan continued its slow rotation, pushing thick air around the room. The wake settled into quiet stillness. And someone heard a sound. It was faint at first, barely noticeable above the hum of the fan. A dull tapping noise echoed softly from somewhere near the coffin. One of the relatives shifted in their chair, assuming it had been a random creak from the building. Moments later, the sound came again. This time it was louder. Gilberto looked up immediately. The noise had come from the coffin. The room fell silent as everyone listened. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then another sharp knock struck the inside of the wooden lid. The sound was unmistakable. A woman gasped. Someone else whispered a prayer under their breath. Another knock echoed through the wood, louder than before. Panic swept through the room as relatives jumped to their feet. Chairs scraped loudly against the floor as people backed away from the coffin in shock. Gilberto felt his heart racing as he stepped closer. The knocking continued. It was coming from inside. "Open it!" someone shouted. Two relatives rushed forward to help him. Their hands trembled as they unlocked the coffin lid. For a moment, none of them moved, afraid of what they might see. Then Gilberto lifted the lid. Inside, Bella Montoya was moving. Her body shifted weakly beneath the funeral sheets wrapped around her. Her chest rose and fell rapidly as she struggled to breathe. Her hands pressed faintly against the fabric covering her torso. For a moment, no one spoke, unable to process what they were seeing. The woman they believed had died hours earlier was alive. Chaos erupted instantly. Someone shouted that she was breathing while others rushed forward in disbelief. Gilberto leaned over the coffin, calling desperately to his mother. Her eyes remained closed, but her fingers twitched beneath the sheets. The room exploded into frantic movement. Within minutes, relatives lifted Bella from the coffin and carried her outside. A car was waiting and they rushed her inside it. Gilberto held her hand during the frantic drive back to the hospital. Her breathing sounded strained, but she was alive. The reality of what happened felt surreal. When they arrived at the hospital, medical staff reacted with visible shock. Bella was rushed immediately into the emergency room once again. Monitors were attached and tubes inserted to stabilize her breathing. Doctors worked quickly trying to understand how a woman who had been declared dead was now alive. Soon she was transferred into the intensive care unit. In the days that followed, news of the incident spread quickly. Officials from Ecuador's health ministry opened an investigation into the circumstances surrounding Bella's case. A technical committee began reviewing hospital procedures and the timeline of events. Medical experts examined how the death had been declared. Questions multiplied with every passing day. Meanwhile, Bella remained in critical condition in the ICU. Machines surrounded her hospital bed, carefully monitoring her heartbeat and breathing. Gilberto visited whenever he could, still struggling to comprehend everything that had happened. Only days earlier, he had believed he was preparing to bury his mother. Now she lay fighting for her life. The memory of that moment in the funeral home has haunted Gilberto forever. So in this episode, we had the pigman butcher and the coffin knock. Which one is legit and which one is a lie? The legit one was the coffin knock. This story took place in June of 2023. Bella Montoya went to the hospital for a stroke but then was reported dead. She was later found alive after banging on her coffin. She was rushed back to the hospital again where she lived for a week in critical care before officially dying of a stroke a second time.